Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. My name is Fernando Arencibia, and with me, as always, is the ever-enthusiastic Jennifer. There you go, Jennifer. There you go, right on cue. I love it. Jennifer Woolman. Hi, Jennifer.
Hello. Wepa, everybody.
All right. Don't get out of control. All right. No.
I have to. It's Thursday. I love Thursday.
It's called Between Two Chairs. It's not out of the box, wild. That'll be the next iteration.
Hey, I'm happy. I live in Miami. What can I say? It's a beautiful day.
I love it. All right, Jennifer. So let's break down today. We're going to do an episode that we have done in the past, which, we call the Anatomy of a Deal series, right? So
we're kind of slow because this is only our second in the series. But
well,
we do like the idea. It started with an idea that was a little bit more.
It's only the 78th episode. We have plenty of time.
That's true. And there are going to be other iterations of this when we get our act together. But yeah, I love these because, we've had conversations before about what people think that aren't involved in real estate, what people think happens during a transaction. And we always like to set people's expectations of what a deal looks like and what the process looks like. So these anatomies of a deal really get to be a deeper dive into a process, and they're instead of being theory, they're actual. They're on deals that have already closed. And in addition to talking about general things about the asset class, etc., it also helps raise issues or questions that you should be asking either as a broker or an investor in this asset class as you go along, or insights that one of us had during the deal, whatever we learned during the deal, because you learn something during pretty much every single deal. Something is really a little bit different or nuanced. So let's jump right in. Today we're going to talk about a deal that you did, a warehouse deal in Doral.
Worked on this warehouse deal in Doral. Definitely a lot of lessons in it. And the breakdown of the deal was the buyers were investors. I was representing the buyers, and they were looking for an industrial freestanding building in Doral that would give them that yield. They were coming from New York, and they had been industrial investors in New York, outside of the city of New York, right? And so they understood the product, and they knew exactly what they were looking for in regards to location, in regards to the quality of the building, the build itself. They were very sensitive to the quality of the construction of the property and of the location. And part of what happens when someone is coming from out of state is that they have to go through a process of learning different markets, right? And even within Doral, there are very different iterations of industrial, right? Because they were built at different times and they were built in very different ways, right? There are trends that happen in every industry, including the logistics industry, and we can see it today, right? A lot of the buildings that were built in the 80s, for example, didn't have the ceiling heights that we see today, right? And so they were looking for something that was substantial enough to merit the investment, something that would be a part of their portfolio for a long time, because they were selling property in New York and they wanted to basically invest in South Florida, and they already were developing roots in the Tri-County area, right? Mm-hmm. We found this property. It is a 30,000 square foot freestanding industrial building. And we found this property right around the time of COVID. Property had been on the market for a little bit. And recently we did an episode about myths in commercial real estate. Right. And one of the myths that people have is that when the property is on the market, that there's sometimes they feel that, well, if you're selling the property, there's something wrong with it, right? Or if you're selling the property and it's, if it's not an off-market deal, I'm not going to get a good deal.
Or if it's been listed too long.
Or it's been listed too long, whatever. And what happens is, personally, my pet peeve about that is that you really need to look at the asset. It's part of your homework, right? If you're going to be an investor, it's part of your homework to do that due diligence and to really see it for what it is and ignore what the rest of the market feels about a property, right? And so I found that this property was a bit of a hidden gem. I also didn't understand why the market had not absorbed it, but remember that this was during the time of, we were just on the other side of understanding the new realities of the pandemic. This was in 2020, right? And so obviously there's a bunch of reasons. One, the investors kind of hold back to see what's going to happen. We're in a, global pandemic.
Unprecedented times.
Yeah. Right? A 1 in 100 year, event, black swan event, as they call it, right? And so the good news is that by then, my clients had already seen a lot of property and they understood that they definitely wanted to be in Doral. And they definitely wanted to be in a property that was in this kind of build, right? And so we started negotiating for the purchase of the property. Now, what was interesting here is that this building had a twin building next to it, right? And was also 30,000 square feet. And the current owner of the building had a tenant there for many, many years that was occupying both buildings, right? Tenant leaves for more space and they decide to move to Broward County. The prior tenants were, an electronics manufacturing company. Right? They needed more space. And so the owner decides to put both of these buildings both for sale and for lease. Well, one of the buildings gets leased out. The other building was vacant. It was the vacant building that we were negotiating, but my client was also interested in the building next to it. Well, it just so happens that that tenant had a right of first refusal. And so the tenant executed on the right of first refusal and was going to buy the building. However, because the building at one point was occupied by the same tenant, that tenant wanted to have a way to connect between one building and the other. So they built an exterior tunnel, right? An interior tunnel between the two buildings that was enclosed in order to be able to connect both buildings together. And that way the workers didn't have to go outside, go around,
right.
Get in a car and get it if it's raining, all that other stuff. So now my client gets into an agreement to buy this building, knowing that the other building was going to be purchased by the other tenant. But we have to now address this tunnel that is connecting the two buildings, right? And so we can get into a little bit of that a little later, but I just wanted to give you kind of the dynamics of this is where we are. We're engaging now into negotiating the purchase of the building. We have to address this tunnel issue, and that's pretty much a good place to start.
Okay, so that's an overview of the property and the deal that we're gonna kind of dissect right. In this anatomy of a deal. But let's start with the basics that we go over. Why do investors like about this asset class, specifically right. Warehouse?
Yeah. First of all, most of warehouses, if you're having a freestanding warehouse like this, is you are likely to have a single tenant user, right? So they're not dealing with multiple tenants, right? And usually these leases are at least 5 years with options to renew, right? You may sometimes get a 3-year lease, but in reality, if you're occupying this much space, you're most likely going to be there for a long time, right? There is not a huge amount of built out cost as if you were having 30,000 square feet of office. So imagine if you have 30,000 square feet of office divided into 10 office spaces, 3,000 square feet per office, and now you have to have 10 tenants, and then the build-out cost that is going to be very specific to the kind of tenants that are going to come into the space. So what an investor in industrial likes is, number one, they're dealing with either logistics or they're dealing with manufacturing. It gives you the opportunity to be able to lease out those 30,000 square feet to one to one tenant that has the need, right? And usually the office space will only occupy about 10% of that building. In this case, it was a little bit more. They had about 5,000 square feet, so it was more like closer to 18-20% of the space. But usually you have like a 10% space there, so the build out wasn't too crazy. You had dock height doors, right, which was important, and 3 dock height doors, and you had a really great entryway and plenty of parking, which again is...
And this is one of the few asset classes where maybe having one user is better. In most other asset classes, you don't want one user, and lenders actually ask for way more money to be held in escrow or as reserves if you only have one tenant, like a one-tenant office building. And you can have warehouses that are subdivided into bays. And then, so another reason people like this asset class is it's pretty basic, right? It's basically 4 walls, a concrete floor, and a roof.
No doubt.
And
when we interviewed Gus Fonte, who is an industrial developer, that's what he likes about it too. It's clean, it's clear. There's not a lot of what he calls frou-frou. There's not a lot of fancy stuff to it. It is what it is, and really, it's the functional use of it that is primarily of importance.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So the tenant is always going to look at those things. And, and you're looking at things like the ingress and egress from the parking. How easy is it going to be to load and unload? If you're looking at it as a manufacturing center, it inevitably becomes also a distribution center, right? Because you have to get all that stuff out, all the materials in, all of the finished product out. So, those things become, very important. Also, I think in South Florida, if you look at it compared to a market like Chicago or a market like California or New York, we don't have an incredible amount of industrial space per capita. So, there is an inherent value in owning industrial space in South Florida, especially if you buy it right.
So speaking of buying it, how do investors evaluate this warehouse industrial properties? What do they look for in order to evaluate it?
So major centers of transportation, so they're looking for major thoroughfares, and they're looking for proximity to interstate highway systems, right? They're looking to be close to the turnpike. They're looking to be close to Palmetto, because inevitably it is really a logistics center. And so it's really about the ease of ingress and egress from those major highways and those major thoroughfares. So that's one thing they look for. The second thing they look for is, again, in this case, they wanted to have the dock height doors because the kind of tenant that they wanted to attract for that investment is the kind of tenant that would need that requirement, right? And it also, looking at the area, if this would have been a building that had a 16-foot height ceiling and it wouldn't have had the dock height doors, it would have been much more difficult to lease out, because the competition around there, almost all the buildings have at least one dock height door. Right. And so that becomes important. The amount of parking is important, not only for the employees that are going to occupy 30,000 square feet, but more importantly is the ease of the circumference of, you oftentimes don't think about this, but if you're a truck driver, you always are thinking, how am I going to go, how easy is it for me to get in and out? All of those things become, major factors. The amount of power that is generated and that comes into the building, right? Having 3-phase power. Remember, we had a tenant that had a very high requirement in as far as the amp service that needed to come into the building, and understanding, having that ability. And I think we had a major connection with FPL right across the street. So bringing that power would have been possible without not a major amount of cost. So, things like that has become important. And then height of the ceiling height becomes very important, because there's a certain amount of ceiling height. What has happened in the logistics world is that people have seen the value of stacking. Right. So because now you're able to almost, you really don't 100% double the space, right? But you can add 25 to 40% more space by doing a racking system. And, we've all seen those not so funny, but funny videos of racking systems falling through because, the forklift driver made a mistake. But that's what I mean. Those racking systems become very important, and the way that they are laid out. And when you're configuring the racking system, the number of columns inside of the space then becomes very important, right, and the spacing between those columns become very important. So you get very much into the nitty gritty of those things, but the height then also becomes important, and then everything else is really about things that you would look for anyway, right? Is there any deferred capital investments that I need to make? You know, the condition of the roof, the plumbing system, all of the structural side of things that become important. I'm sorry, one more thing, which I think is very important here that they're looking for is how flexible is the zoning, because not all industrial zoning is the same. Light industrial is not the same as heavy industrial, and you know, you could always go down. Right. If you have a heavy industrial, you could do a light industrial tenant and you'll be perfectly fine, but not the other way around, right? So having the flexibility to be able to have multiple uses there becomes, you know, a very important.
And to your point, I remember another deal that you did where it was kind of like it looked like a warehouse. It was a warehouse. It was being used as a warehouse, but zoning had been changed and could no longer be used as a warehouse. It was only being grandfathered in for the current owner and or tenant. So it's important to not just assume that because there's a warehouse there, it's still warehouse. A lot of warehouse districts are actually being converted into business districts. You know, think of Wynwood, think of Midtown, think of Allapattah, think of some of the areas where they're making it
for sure
more flexible so industrial space can be used as retail or office. So which means that some of the heavy uses or other uses are not allowed anymore. So tell us a little bit more, you know, what to be aware of when you're brokering this type of asset class, you know, other than like zoning. You saw you can see that the issue that you dealt with the bridge and the two different buildings were an issue, but what came up in this deal that maybe you didn't expect?
So I knew that I was going to be responsible for finding a tenant for this vacant space. And what's great about that is that when I was looking at the deal and being able to give them advice, I was looking at it through that prism. Right? Mm-hmm. Because, of course, the landlords would hate to have to acquire something that takes 8 months to occupy. And so
wait, let me interrupt you. Sure. You were looking at through the prism of a potential tenant or as a tenant rep broker?
I'm glad. Yes. Well, I was looking at through the prism of this is an investment vehicle for them.
Right.
Their goal is not just to buy an empty warehouse. The goal is to buy a warehouse where we can find a tenant in there and they can generate the revenue that merits the investment, right? So I was always looking at it through the prism of how would a tenant look at this space, right? And what would need to be done, and most likely what would be the cost of the tenant improvement or any changes in order to get a great tenant in here in place for a long time.
So you actually had three hats on. You had the sales broker, you had the landlord rep, and you had the tenant rep hat on while you were doing this, basically, because you were trying to see...
Correct.
Okay, all the different puzzle pieces.
Right. I was looking at beyond the acquisition once it is acquired, and now I'm, repping the landlord, finding the right tenant and what is the likelihood of that, because that's what my clients were asking of me. How long is it going to take us to lease out the space, right?
Now, when you were negotiating the contract, did the current owner and the current owner's broker allow you to market it for lease once you guys went hard?
I love that you asked that question because you're absolutely right. And so let me tell you about addressing the tunnel because it addresses that question. So they knew that they had to pull permits from the city of Doral in order to demise the tunnel. We also knew that at the time during COVID, the county and the cities were taking longer to process everything because they either were working with a skeleton crew or the crews were working out of their home. And so, again, we knew that this was going to be a prolonged period of time. So part of the negotiation was, number one, making sure that the seller was 100% responsible for closing that permit and doing the enclosure the right way so that the buyers can acquire the property without having to deal with zoning, without having to deal with permitting, without having to deal with any surprises that may come out of it. And the owners happen to be developers. They happen to be single family developers, right, who acquired this property through some other deals, but they were really not industrial owners or commercial owners. Their expertise was that. But however, they understood zoning, they understood permitting and all that stuff, so they felt comfortable taking on that responsibility. But we also knew that because it was going to take a long time, that it would be wasted time to be under contract, to go hard, meaning that after the inspection period was over and my clients were confident that they wanted to make the purchase, they were going to make an additional commitment of funds to be deposited in the property. And then they were going to have to wait months in order for the tunnel to be demised, in order for the permit to be closed, and in order for them to actually be able to complete the purchase of the property. And we put it in the contract that the acquisition would not be completed until that was done. But then we also added a clause where the sellers will give us permission once it was hard for us to be able to list the property, right? And so we made it clear that we would list it and to be able to find a tenant for the property, right? And furthermore, if we found a tenant prior to the sale, that they were not committing to leasing to the tenant, but it would have been part of the conversation. Once the property inspections were completed, and look, what it required is not only a physical inspection of the property, and we noticed that there were issues with the roof that needed to be addressed, but there was also an environmental report, all of the things that a buyer needs to do to make sure that you mitigate any potential risk that are there. There was a fire violation. The fire system needed to be updated. So little things that we found along the way. But once due diligence was over and we came to an agreement on a credit on those little things and everything was done, then at that point, I got a key to the place and we listed the property for lease. What was great about that is that by the time, and it took months, but by the time we get to the closing, I almost see it as if we were coming out of the tunnel of COVID. And even though we were not on the other side of COVID, but meaning that light started to come in, people started to see, oh, this is the path, right? Companies started to grow. They started to see opportunity. And all of a sudden, we started to get a lot of calls for the space. And my clients were able to close on the property. And within a month, the tenant was moving in on a 5-year deal with 2 5-year options to renew. That's
awesome. Now, let me clarify. So you said that there were 2 buildings. Were they 2 separate portfolios?
Separate folios. So there was you didn't have to do a,
that's what I meant. Sorry,
you didn't have to do a title. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
You didn't have to separate title. You didn't have to worry about those things. They were 2 separate folios that were connected by the...
Okay, because I have seen, there are warehouse condos or there are independent buildings that are part of a much bigger industrial complex, and you can buy the whole building, but you're not buying.
And by the way, I believe that was part of the problem with why it took so long to get the permits, because they're 2 separate folios. So you go to the city and you go like, well, there's a tunnel that is connecting these 2. And then sometimes the city will tell you, well, you got to pull a permit for this one and a permit for this one.
Right.
So it just gets very complicated because, sometimes there's not a lot of common sense in the way these things happen.
No, and you had to get the approval. What if the other person still wanted the tunnel, like even though it's not their property or they don't want the expense of getting rid of it. So now you're negotiating with another property owner.
No, and listen, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. It just worked out amazing for my clients because my clients didn't have a lot of carrying costs. They weren't carrying the property for months empty. They were very comfortable. Here's a part of the deal that a lot of people, when I tell the story, they were under contract for over a year, right, to get everything completed, right? By the time we get to the closing table, one of the brokers comes to me because they have a buyer that is interested in the property, and my client was about to double, their investment. And if they would have decided to sell at that point, they would have doubled the value without even...
Just by having a tenant.
Without a tenant.
Without even the tenant.
Without a tenant. It was an end user. And this property sold for close to $4 million. And we were getting offers close to $8 million. So, again, this was a property that people were not looking at. I don't know exactly why, but I think it
could have just been timing, like you said.
Just timing, right? Because we always say the number one word in real estate is location, location, location. But the second one is timing.
And that doesn't mean time the market, because we've already spoken about how bad it is to time the market, but it's about chasing opportunities. So, and this is going to be a whole nother episode, because I think there are huge opportunities in real estate right now across the U.S. But to your point about this one and the timing, people were frozen. It was COVID. Nobody knew, you know, in 2020, depending on what part of 2020 you're in, the vaccine was or wasn't available. People either had the first one and didn't know if it was going to work.
Correct.
Like, we didn't know what was going to happen. Schools were still shut down. Offices were shut down. Restaurants were still shut down.
I remember we saw a bunch of properties with masks on, and, you know, everybody went in their own cars. There was no, you know, there was no socializing.
Right, no hugging.
We didn't go to a restaurant afterwards. You know, there was none of that. But what was great about it is, I think the biggest lesson is you always have to start with the end in mind, right? And we knew that, okay, so the goal is to rent it out. So when we were negotiating, it's not like we had to go back and say, oh, well, you know what, we didn't think about it before, but give us the opportunity to list the property for lease, or give us, you know, like we thought about every scenario that had to do with not only the tunnel, but also, okay, so now we're under contract. It's going to take a long time. I was already hearing that people were having long delays. My food and beverage clients were having long delays in being able to do just the build-out work.
The basics, right?
Just the basic build-out work, right?
The whole logistics
supplies, everything was difficult. So we knew, look, this is going to take some time. So let's think of ways to add clauses here that would be beneficial to your ultimate goal, you know? And, you know, of course, I love to deliver for my clients, but it couldn't have worked out any better.
And to your point about luck, if you're listening and you're not very active in the commercial real estate market and you hear that this deal took a year, you're like, oh my God, you know, because a lot of people think that it's so easy. You go out, you find the property you want. If the numbers work, it's under contract. And, you know, in commercial, maybe 60 to 90 days to close a deal. But more often than not, there's a lot more going on. And so for you to have gotten a seller who was already on the market a while to agree to a long closing, right? So that also goes to the motivation. Luckily, you had a very motivated seller too, that they were willing to give you that much time, because how many times have we received an LOI that, you know, our clients will say, the buyers will say, hey, we want 90 or 120 days for due diligence. And after the 120 days of due diligence, we want 45 days to close, or maybe more. And the seller's like, no, you get 2 weeks due diligence or 30 days due diligence, and you're closing 30 days after that. Right? If you get into that kind of a situation, the deal doesn't get done, especially in something as complicated or as detailed as this deal.
Right. And it was very beneficial, and my clients were cash buyers.
Right.
So there was no lending involved. There was no question mark for the owner of the property to say, well, once the money is hard and they're putting this extra $300,000-400,000 grand down, you know, I know that they're committed. Right. And the cash is there, proof of funds, everything was there. So he felt very comfortable. Give him the keys, let him show the property. And of course, listen, it's not lost on me that that's an awesome responsibility, right? Because they don't own the property yet. If anything happens in that property, so we were always very careful about how we wanted to do the showings and all that stuff, because, you know, everything is risky in a highly litigious society. So
you're showing a property that you don't own yet.
And all stuff. And some of the questions, you know, were asked, well, why are you listing it? You know, you don't really own. And I said, no, we have a written agreement and all that other stuff. And by the way, I even asked the seller to co-sign the listing agreement, you know, to make sure that everybody was kosher and everybody was on the same page. But listen, it couldn't have worked out better. The tenants are still there. They're likely to pick up and they're doing tremendously well. And what was even you know, I mean, I can tell you, I wish every deal would work out like this for my clients. I really would. But when they are underwriting the deal, they're underwriting the deal with $9 rent. Right? You and I both know that you can't get that. And so by the time we got a tenant, that number was closer to $15. You know, so again, the numbers just got so much better very, very quickly. And
but the good thing is that they based their numbers on a lower number, right?
Correct.
We always say, we've seen, right, we always say be extremely conservative. We've seen this a lot with buildings that are bought, they're multifamily buildings in areas that are zoned for hotel. They sell them for Airbnb and short-term rentals. And so people are calculating what they can get for Airbnb and short-term when in reality they should probably be calculating on what they can get it for a multifamily. And then if the Airbnbs do come through and nobody changes the ordinance or says you can't, do Airbnbs here or whatever happens, it's based on the more conservative number.
Well, and also because this was it worked out as a triple net deal, but it was really interesting. Those negotiations were also very interesting because so basically the tenant was responsible for any overage over the base year. Meaning, okay, these are my taxes and insurance for year in 2020. So in 2021, whatever becomes the difference, the tenant was going to pay. But the tenant was aware, well, the owners haven't bought the property yet.
Right.
Once they buy it, it'll adjust, and that adjustment can be huge because the current owners have owned the property for 30 years, right? So what was negotiated, which I thought was fair, was, okay, we'll pay anything over, but the base year for taxes needs to be once it adjusts in 2021.
Once it adjusts for the sale.
Right? And and my clients understood that dynamic, and they knew that it was going to be a big hit, but by then they were getting $4 more in rent, than they were expecting. So the numbers just worked out.
Right. And that's the other thing I mentioned, the 10%. And in this case, it would have been more than that because it's the sales, it's adjusted based on the sale.
Correct.
But that's another thing to consider is when you're buying a property and or leasing a property in the state of Florida, its property taxes are capped for non-homesteaded properties, which is all the commercial properties, at 10% a year. But 10% a year is huge. So if you have a pass-through and you're a tenant calculating based on 3% or CPI, and you have a clean triple net, which means you're paying everything above and beyond, and you don't cap those expenses such as insurance, you could be taking a huge hit as a tenant so that your income isn't, your income numbers. And this is especially true. It's true in any business that you're operating out of a leased space, but it's especially true for something like F&B where the margins are really small and you can't really pass stuff through. So that was another thing to just throw out there. Alrighty. Do you have anything else to add? Those were all the questions. We talked about the positives of owning, what to look out for in the asset class.
I think at this point, it was an exciting transaction to be a part of because, you do learn a lot about the different intricate aspects. Also, to highlight what we always highlight, that things are never cookie cutter in commercial, and that when you're negotiating, everything is negotiable. Right? Everything is negotiable, and it's a matter of putting two parties together and making sure that they see the that they see the value that is there and putting the deal through. And when you have two people that are committed to putting the deal together, then everything works out.
Did the seller have a broker?
The seller had a broker, a very good broker, who was very responsive and let us do our job, and was cooperative, and he even brought a couple of people himself that were interested in the property for lease, and they didn't escalate to a level of an LOI, but we had a lot of interest, and I give a lot of credit to my clients because you could tell that they know what they were looking for in the quality of the investment, and equally they were very clear about the kind of tenant that they wanted to have in the place. Good. So that worked out.
Alrighty, well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for joining us, everybody, for Anatomy of a Deal.
Absolutely. I hope you can give us some feedback. If you like this series, we could do more. We love always sharing case studies, and because you learn so much. I mean, that's the heart of when we talk about being an experienced broker is you get involved in so many different transactions, and what you learn is infinitely valuable. You almost always pay it forward, like somebody else takes advantage of that experience, and that's why we love what we do.
Till next time, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.